Welcome to Hack Your Hazcom. It is my pleasure to introduce you to today's guest, Melissa Owen. She is the founder of AMBIENTELEGAL and advises multinational companies on regulatory compliance and sustainability across Latin America. Born and raised in Mexico, Melissa is an international lawyer licensed in the U.S. who speaks Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, French, and English. Her knowledge of the cultural, language, and legal dimensions in both Latin America and the U.S. makes her uniquely suited to guide multinational clients through the complex and rapidly changing world of environmental, sustainability, and health and safety matters in the region. And for over 25 years, she has advised Fortune 100 companies and international trade associations on emerging chemical regulations, circular economy, extended producer responsibility, product stewardship, and other regulatory issues. With your wealth of knowledge, I thought it would be great to have you talk about the nuances of Latin America. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Atana. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the great intro.
All right. Well, I've heard you in the past talk about how Latin America is kind of like a Pangea state, a supercontinent that's shifting, breaking apart. And like the EU, where there's one centralized body like ECA, Latin America is a collection of sovereign new mountains, so to speak. Does this lack of a centralized EU of Latin America make harmonization impossible? Or are we seeing maybe a unique decentralized form of alignment emerging through the OECD?
That's a great question, Atanu, and I think that you stated it right. We have to start out when you're talking about Latin America by acknowledging that it is a figment, it's a construct. If you look at your map, there is no Latin America, and maps differ and companies differ. Some of my companies and clients consider Mexico to be part of North America, which it was under the North American Free Trade Agreement and the USMCA, and others I included properly, I think, included in Latin America because of its history and language. But there's debate about what is and isn't in Latin America. It's important to remember Latin America is really made up of 20 to 30 different sovereign nations and international territories, speaking multiple languages, primarily Spanish, and for the case of our largest country in the region, Brazil, that's Portuguese. So it's important at the outset to understand, just like you said, that Latin America is not an EU. We do not have one voice for Latin America. What we do have is certain regional trade blocks. They're not America's wide for now, but we do have, for example, coming up from the bottom, Mercosur, very important because they're in the news. We'll talk later about the Mercosur EU trade agreement, right? But Mercosur is made up of four primary member nations, which is Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil. Coming up from there in the northern part of South America, you would have what we call the Andean community, and that's Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador. And then you have Central America has its own integration. You have CARICOM for the Caribbean. You have the Commonwealth nations in the Caribbean also have a certain level of harmonization. So in a regulatory world that you and I work in, some of those trade blocks take on significance because at the regional level within the member countries, you do have some coalition, specifically around certain themes, and some regulate more than others. Some apply directly to the members, some need to be adopted. So Andean community, formerly Andean Pact, that's Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, when they determine at the Andean level that a regulation exists, like pesticides, cosmetics, personal hygiene products, cleaning products, it automatically applies in the four member countries. So you get harmonization almost immediately. Not the case for Mercosur. Mercosur is more like the EU. It passes the Mercosur standard, and then each member country, each of the four, needs to enact it into local legislation. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes it takes years. So you end up with harmonization as a goal at the Mercosur level, but not always an achievement. The reason you bring up the OECD is because on the chemical front, in particular, industrial chemicals in particular, the OECD is the biggest driver we have, more than the SICOM, the predecessor of what is now the GFC. But the OECD membership is the carrot instead of the stick that is getting a lot of results. Latin American countries prize membership in the OECD because it's seen of joining kind of the country club of trading partners. And so Mexico, the first, my native country, and the first country in the region to be a member of OECD. But now we have Chile and Colombia, and we have up for accession Peru and Brazil, Argentina. So as these countries come up for accession, what the OECD does is send in one of the member countries of the OECD comes in and does evaluation of this new potential club member. And they do a gap analysis on your regulations. And they have a certain list of, you know, we need to see this kind of regulations. And one of those we need to see is a chemical management framework. Most of the countries up for accession have interpreted that as we need some kind of a local reach inspired scheme, or in Brazil's case, and it predates the OECD consideration, they are actually a CMP, a Canadian model, is what they really found attractive and best for them. But the OECD um, accession drives the calendar to the extent that when you're at these regional meetings, the heads of the chemical agenda for the government literally get up and say, we enacted it that year because, you know, we needed to accede to the OECD. So definitely the OECD coming in and saying you need something like a chemical management framework, which would be like an inventory and then a registration inventory, then risk assessment, and finally risk management measures, what I call the chemical control pathway. In the four countries that we have it, but for Brazil, the OECD has been the driver. So that's what's coming along, and that kind of is on top of these regional harmonizations that we see with, Mercosur, Andean Pact, or the Central American organization.
Right. Well, so you mentioned with the chemical compliance, are we seeing a sort of shift moving from regulating chemicals by function, for example, like if it's a pesticide or a cosmetic, to regulating maybe more by definition? What is the actual chemical? And if so, is this sort of fundamental change in legal philosophy? Does it tend to complicate things for companies that have historically only worried about perhaps just the end use of their products rather than a chemical inventory as a whole?
Yes to everything you said. That's yes. So what's happening when I give these talks, around the world? I always have a starter slide that says what's new, what's not.
Mm.
So in the what's not category, Latin America is not new to chemical regulation. It loves to join international chemical treaties like Stockholm, Montreal, Minamata. They join quickly, and all of them are members. They have for decades regulated chemical products. So we have complex schemes and detailed regulations. I mean, they'll keep you just as busy as any European or U.S. country in certain countries and sectors. So if you think of pesticides, crop protection, cleaning products, cosmetics, pharmaceutical, medical devices, paints and coatings, biocides, those are regulated in great detail. We also have worker protection rules. Those have existed for decades. Every country in the region has chemical precursor rules, drug precursors. What we have not had is these REACH inspired schemes, TOSC inspired schemes, CNP inspired schemes, these kind of, as you pointed out, regulation as a chemical itself, not the functional product that the chemical represents. So, industrial chemicals, to a great extent, if they were not covered by an international treaty, have gone potentially unregulated in these countries. You didn't really have any controls on them. So what we're seeing now, and the four countries that have adopted this so far are Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Peru, with Chile and Colombia already implementing, and Colombia already has its first national inventory. Chile has two parts of its final four-part inventory in place, and it's a tectonic shift. So companies in the region are scrambling, is about how I would put it. They're doing an amazing job with something that's totally new. The interest in compliance is absolutely laudable. I do not get onto a local webinar, virtual for the most part, hosted by either the government of or the Chemical Industry Association of Colombia, Peru, Mexico, Chile, that doesn't have 6 to 800 people attending with questions that run the clock out. The hunger to know and comply is really laudable. And I think it's hitting everyone. They are realizing that for the first time, they're going to have to understand their supply chain. So if you are a local importer or a local manufacturer in Chile and Colombia, already you are having to move through these registrations. And I supported registrations in both countries for foreign companies. Now, important to remember in Colombia, Peru, and Chile, you have to be a local importer or a local manufacturer to register. There is no role for the foreign manufacturer except to protect some confidential business information in Colombia and Peru. But it is not an only representative. You can't register your own chemical. We only get that in Brazil now. But the local importers, your customers, if you're a US entity, are for the first time having to get you on the phone and go, hey, we need an SDS that includes composition. We need to be able to report on every item in the chemical. We need to understand, is this a mixture or a neat or pure chemical? We have so many questions about this. And the US will, one of my clients will send an SDS down, and the Colombian entity goes, thank you, but that's not a Colombia compliant SDS. I'm going to have to start all over again. You and the SDS didn't adopt the environmental aspects of the GHS, only the, of physical and health hazards. And we have to have one that goes over, ecotoxin, all of the environmental aspects. So translation is not localization in this case. So yes, it's a tectonic shift, and it's requiring a full reworking of how Latin America views and reports its chemical inputs.
Okay, okay. So seeing how these international treaties and perhaps the workplace OSHA rules here in the US act as precursors to the new requirements, are you finding companies making the mistake of thinking, hey, we're complying with the treaties, so we're safe, failing to maybe realize that these new mountains, perhaps, that we're taking the metaphor here, comprehensive chemical control, requires a completely different level of data transparencies from these companies? Or what do you see?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I don't know that I don't, at least from my clients, everyone is coming at this with good faith and a desire to comply. But we need to back it up. These are very new systems for countries that are new to these schemes as well. So there's a lot of learning going on the regulated community and the regulator community. So what I love about Latin America is, for the most part in this space, there is a great deal of cooperation. Everybody comes together with kind of a good attitude. It's not the bad cop enforcement vision. There is a different view in Latin America between the regulated community and the regulators. They're often meeting in different fora to discuss things, to converse. Any Mexican official standard called a norma oficial mexicana, that is issued across any sector, starts out, the first lines of it are all of the industry associations and specific companies that were invited to be a part of its creation. It's just such a different vision that we have here in the US. As a US lawyer, I understand you're not going to go talk to EPA or OSHA unless you've got your lawyer with you. In Latin America, they'd say, why are you coming along? We meet with these people all the time.
Interesting.
But that being said, what I find is there is still a good subset of companies that absolutely do not know they have this obligation. So in Chile in the fall, Chile has opted to handle its REACH inspired scheme in 4 different registration phased in dates. The pure industrial hazardous substances, pure non-industrial hazardous substances, and then hazardous substances and industrial mixtures, and hazardous substances and non-industrial mixtures. And the mixtures will be in 27 and 29, but we already had the neat industrial and non-industrial in 2024 and 2025. 2025, we got 11 substances registered. Clearly, the agency professional that was at a meeting in Peru that I attended in October said clearly some folks did not get the message, that they needed to to register. So we are still, it's a real interesting thing for me as a lawyer that represents, companies across the spectrum, the differences in level of place on the learning curve that they're on. Some companies are calling and going, hey, when are they going to enact that? And I'm like, well, yeah, 5 years ago, the registration deadline is already, what do we do? And I have other companies who are like, hey, I'm really ready. I'm ready to register here in Brazil. Let's go. Who's my local? And I'm like, they don't even have the platform ready. You're the gunner. And we love them. We love our ready to go clients. But I think that you are totally right that some companies are just barely waking up to the fact they need to register. And this lack of transparency is huge because they are having to potentially share very sensitive information with importers in Latin America who never called to ask for this. So there's distrust, there's lack of, a situation to protect it. Colombia, after the fact that it issued its decree, got told by industry, hey, we need some kind of confidential business information protection. And they created this fiction called the foreign representative, known as the RE, Representante Exclusivo del Exterior, which is not an OR. It causes so much confusion, but it allows the foreign company to come in and say, hey, we will register the confidential information for our local importer. And so you ask the importer, please name us, Acme US as the company. And I'm proud to say my client and I were the first, apparently found out later, we were the first company to take advantage of that option. It worked great for us, and the government worked really hard to get that working. And so there's a way to protect some of that confidential information. But yeah, all new, and it is a real shock to some of my clients that this is already up and running.
Well, and, speaking for the foreign exporter side of things, we see that these chemical control reach-like schemes that you've talked about, in Brazil, Peru, Colombia, and Chile, they share a common spirit, but of course they're not identical. Yeah, and for the regulatory manager, where do you think the subtle divergences lie? And are there specific data requirements or deadlines for these countries that's tripping up the foreign exporters?
Oh, I think that it is absolutely just a minefield for the foreign exporter, and the foreign exporter are my clients, so I've given special talks. I call it the role of the foreign chemical manufacturer. And so the important thing to keep in mind is, and I try to post regularly, where we are on a chemical law calendar, where we are on these 4 things. It's important to keep in mind that Chile and Colombia are already up, implemented, and running. So those are the countries that if you haven't already, you should do so now, register. Peru, we're still waiting for an implementing regulation. Brazil, we're still waiting for an implementing regulation, but primarily for Brazil, which will be the big reach inspired scheme of our region because of the size of the country. And they are the 4th to 6th, depending who you ask, largest chemical industry in the world. So this is a really important country for chemicals. So Brazil's scheme, companies will have 3 years to register from the date in which the platform, the online registration platform, is released. And the government has 3 years to create that from November 14th, 2024. So by November 2027, the government is required to have this platform ready, and then we'll have 3 years that we can be registering under Brazil Reach, as I call it. Um, the commonalities are there. There are definitely commonalities, but I think that it is more different than common. Um, for the thresholds, for example, Peru, Brazil, and Chile, it's all 1 ton imported or manufactured per year. And then Colombia is 100 kilograms. I mean, it's a minuscule amount. And then even what is and isn't in the larger scope for Chile and Colombia, it's only hazardous substances, and it's hazardous per the GHS. Any hazard, whether it's a physical hazard, any of the 3 environmental, health, or physical hazards. That is not the case for Peru and Brazil. They're going to register hazardous and non-hazardous. And the scopes are reduced. For Colombia, for example, it's the smallest. It's a hazardous industrial chemicals only. Hazardous industrial, no final products. For Chile, it's hazardous, industrial, and non-industrial. And then the scope only grows for Peru and Brazil, where it's both industrial and non. I think that one of the best places to start for companies is finding out the countries, and then the deadlines and the amounts, but then the exemptions, because you really want to go exemption hunting. You want to be exempted out of the obligation.
Sure.
And each country has a laundry list of exemptions, and there's a lot of commonalities. Generally, regulated final products are generally exempt. That's cosmetics, pesticides, foods and food products, veterinary products, medical devices, the long list of products that were already covered, like I said, by those existing sanitary registrations. But ojo, as we say in Spanish, keep an eye open. That does not necessarily mean the raw inputs to make those products. So if the country like Chile has an exemption for cosmetic products, that does not cover your raw material, even if it's shipped to Chile to make cosmetic products. It only covers the cosmetic product, the final good, not the raw inputs for them. And we see that similarity across the four countries as well.
Wow, lots to think about just in that quad alone.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So now moving on, maybe in Argentina, I believe they have something with revision 5 versus revision 9. I think revision 5 currently has workplaces, and Argentina is probably looking at maybe a narrow adoption of revision 9 for the crop protection, lawn and garden products.
Right.
And practically speaking, do we see, if I'm shipping a drum to Argentina, what is my obligations to resolve any conflicts between maybe an older workplace standard and a newer national standard? And in that case, would I have to worry about maybe dual labeling, or does one mountain overshadow the other?
That's a great question, and we don't really know yet. I don't know of any official guidance on that. If I were recommending a client, they call me with that question, I would say label with Rev 9, and let's hope that that works in the workplace as well. But I think before we go there, if we can just talk about GHS in our region more globally before we get into the details, because it's so funny. I'm from Mexico, and in Mexico, we say Dios está en los detalles. God is in the details. And then I moved to the US, and they told me the devil's in the details. I don't know who's in them, but he's big or she's big. And we'll get to the details, but it's important to remember that the GHS is the key to all of this. I was at the regional meeting for the Latin American Chemical Cooperation Forum in Peru in October, and the OECD was there. 10 different countries were present with government representatives. Amazing. And about the one thing we could all agree on as we decide how the chemical control pathway should look was GHS is the building block. That's what we all agree on. It's the common language. It's not common, and we'll get into that. Each country has its own, but GHS is the building block for all of this. And so we need to understand that GHS is what's coming online along with these new chemical management schemes. The countries that we talked about, for example, Peru and Chile both adopted the GHS as part of this new REACH-inspired scheme. That's how united they are. And the OECD is a really big promoter of the GHS. So if you work in the GHS, we need your support in Latin America. We are getting more and more. It's being adopted, at the national level. The latest country in Latin America to adopt it fresh was El Salvador last year, adopted the GHS. But what we're seeing now, Atano, is exactly what you're talking about, this partial adoption in specific cases. So in Argentina, for years, they've had Rev 5 in the workplace. They're one of the countries that have had the GHS adopted, along with Brazil and Mexico and several others that have had it in the workplace, for a decade or more. But now Argentina issued late last year this standard, revolutionizing and deregulating how it's going to handle a broad swath of regulated products, fertilizers, pesticides, and lawn and garden care. And all of a sudden it says these need to be labeled and categorized according to the GHS Rev 9. So we don't quite know yet how that will play out, but it is not unusual. We are seeing first countries like Argentina that have the GHS in the workplace at one level and then adopt this newer one over here in this other sphere. But we see, for example, if you'll allow me to move on to the Dominican Republic, we're seeing countries that haven't adopted it yet at the national level. We don't have in the Dominican Republic República Dominicana has not adopted the GHS yet at the national level in the workplace or anywhere else. And then they pop out with this new GHS for cosmetics and cleaning products, a new standard for registration and regulation of cosmetics and cleaning products. It's quite broad. It's cosmetics, personal care, and household cleaning products. And they called for GHS labeling and SDS. And we don't even have the GHS adopted at the national level there. So one of the big trends I see is this move toward GHS for consumer products. It's going on across countries. Chile clearly adopted 4 phased in, and the last tranche of the DHS that will apply there is to mixtures in consumer products. So Chile will be one of the first countries that says, no, 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 all consumer products need to follow GHS labeling. Colombia, in theory, adopted the same in 2018, but it needs an implementing standard from the Ministry of Health that has not come out yet. So we're still waiting on that. But then you'll have countries like Argentina or here, Dominican Republic, that just pop out and say it. And the latest, since you and I even had the plan to have this call, my own native Mexico is doing this now. Mexico has had GHS in the workplace for years, in 2015 and mandatory as of 2018. And now they just put out last week a draft official Mexican standard known as a NOM or NOM on labeling for paint. And this is both professional and consumer products. And it now, for the professional and industrial paints, is going to require full GHS labeling for a product outside of the workplace, something totally new for Mexico. It's the first example I know of applying GHS to product labeling. We have borrowed little bits of the GHS and not called it that, not mentioned GHS, and tucked it in some standards like NOM 189 for household cleaning products, which is a broad category in Mexico. But nowhere have I seen where we just go, no, GHS, yeah, that's the label. That's what we're going to require for this product in the workplace or not. So when you go to place that, professional use paint on the market at Mexico Lowe's or, Mexico Home Goods, you are going to need to put a GHS label on.
Unreal. Especially with varying adoptions of the GHS, that just makes it
Exactly.
nuts.
It does.
And, speaking about the GHS, it's, it is commonly referred to as kind of a building block, maybe a common language that we can all get to with compliance. But since Latin America is kind of adopting all these different revisions at different speeds, are we actually achieving a common language, or do you think like we're creating, let's call them regulatory dialects, right? Where a compliant SDS in Peru is technically non-compliant in Chile. What do we do there?
100% dialects. Yes. Somebody much brighter than I said the only thing missing in the GHS is the H. There is no harmonization,
Right.
or a friend of mine called it the globally hybridized system. And it is. As soon as you say Chile GHS, Mexico GHS, then we no longer have the commonality. I think it's important to remember. I mean, I think that is true, and I literally, work at the intersection of the different dialects. But we do need to remember that at least it is common in some things. It gets companies thinking about. It gets Latin American companies, the importers, the local manufacturers, thinking about tying their products to this new system. So even though the system doesn't match up perfectly and your SDS can't literally potentially be used in the other country, even neighboring countries require a change. Chile GHS is not the same as Argentina GHS, and your SDS will change. Brazil, this is the year that they're requiring mandatory. They adopted, they made a big jump last year. Well, they adopted it 2 years ago, and it became mandatory as July 4th of 2025, and it changed the name. So literally every GHS needs to go from the FISPIQI to the SDS. And that change alone is requiring companies to get in there. So I think you're right. It's definitely creating dialects. And so you can't just swap out, you can't expect that SDS will serve perfectly in the other country, but it is a common basis, at least. Now we are thinking, oh, we need to classify according to the GHS, and the products need to have an SDS. And so at least those big ideas are coming online. It's in that devil or God in the details that varies. And I think dialects is a great way to think of it. It's a common language with dialect.
Interesting. Yeah, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, the H is so, like, we call it silent, right?
Oh,
Harmonization.
that's a great one. Yeah. La muda, we say in Spanish, which it is in Spanish. So we can really stand by it.
So going back to, the common metaphor, we're talking about old mountains and new mountains here. When you look at kind of these old mountains of regulation versus these new mountains rising now, do you feel like there's a big mindset shift required for these legacy companies? And what do you think uh, some good advices would be for these companies in dealing with the shifts?
I think that uh, that's a really great question. I think that it does require a shift in mindset because I think the focus for companies for so long has been compliance with the EU, or compliance with the US, or compliance with Canada. And I think it is very interesting. I mean, it's an interesting moment to be having this conversation, but I think that there are geopolitical shifts occurring that require us to um, start to think more about the global South as a possible source of regulation. I think that it's important to think of the global South, or countries that you didn't think of before as the source of regulations. I don't think is without a precedent for us to think that, for 10 or 20 years, Latin America, prior to the US not going through with the Kyoto Protocol, dating myself here a little bit, prior to the heartbreak that Latin America felt when Bill Clinton could not deliver on his promise of the Kyoto Protocol, every regulation in Latin America, when I started in this business 30 years ago, copied the US. They went to the Code of Federal Regulations and took what we said and implemented, especially Mexico, when we needed to come into NAFTA in 94. And then you get the heartbreak of the Kyoto Protocol, and all eyes shifted to the EU. At the time, also when ECA and a lot of important directives, REACH, but also WE and ROT and so many others were coming online. And so for 20 years, we've all been trying to catch up with Europe, and we'd looked over there. For Latin America, EU regs are sexy because they publish them in Spanish and Portuguese, which are our two big languages. So it's a handy model. You can go get them as a model law and then adapt them. But I think that's really changing. I don't see it as unthinkable that we will all be trying to look to and implement Chinese standards, especially given the significance. Brazil's largest trading partner is China, not the United States. I mean, we need to think about the realignment. The BRICS countries are likely to be a source, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and BRICS Plus, it's now called. Other countries in my region are trying to join, like Colombia. So I think that BRICS will also be a source of regulatory harmonization. I see already. So I think that it requires a shift in mindset. Instead of thinking, how will these Latin American countries be reworking our US or European standards? We need to come in with a completely open mind and say, what are your regulations? What do I need to do to put my products on the market in Chile and not be surprised that they have them, because some of my clients are, and come in, with a very, I think it takes a level of humility to come into a new market and say, why don't you tell me? So I think listening is a really important skill. Talk to your colleagues in those countries. If you're a multinational and you have the luxury of really competent people working for your subsidiary in Chile, Peru, and Colombia, ask them, what's new in our region? What's going on? For companies in this crazy time of changing standards, I cannot talk highly enough about the work being done by the national trade associations. If your company is large enough and lucky enough to be a member of, for example, the Chemical Industry Association for country X, ANIC for Mexico, ABIQUIM for Colombia, ANDI Colombia, SNA in Peru, ASIQUIM. If I forget one, somebody's going to be mad, but y'all know I love y'all. And those trade associations have their finger on the pulse. So you need to tap in your company, go mining in your company for what team members are sitting in those meetings and start telling them, tell me what they're saying about chemicals. I need to know. I'm up here in Peoria and I have oversight over all of the hemisphere. Start feeding back to me that information, you know? So I think it takes humility. I think it takes a lot of listening. I think you have to marshal new resources. And then you just have to get in and roll up your sleeves and realize it's going to take a lot. A fabulous Brazilian team member from Henkel presented a special presentation at the Latin American Regional Cooperation Forum in Peru, talking about what his company had to do to register their substances under Colombia's REACH inspired scheme. And it was 2 years of work. I cannot tell you the systems they had to put into place. These are new things that require a lot of lift. So don't be short on resources or time. Compliance will take some time for some of these new schemes, especially these REACH-inspired schemes, Chile, Colombia, and next up, Peru and Brazil. So I would say humility, operate and mobilize the resources you have through trade associations or your own team members in those countries. Check out free sources. I have a blog and a thing. A ton of you talk all the time. Lean into your U.S. memberships, like Society for Chemical Hazard CHC does a great job of outreach and bringing people on to talk at your forums and different things like that. So the information's out there very often for free. It's just going to take some rolling up sleeves and realizing it's going to take some effort. You can't just assume that they are doing Brazil PASCA or Chile EU REACH. They're not.
Okay, great advice. I mean, yeah, with all the rolling balls or juggling that you got to do throughout these regions, that's excellent advice to take. So, as of the recording today, we are in early part of 2026, January. So this is kind of a time for forecasts and looking out for what you see as far as what do you think where we're going to be in 2026. If the previous year was about climbing these new mountains, do you feel like 2026 is a plateau of stability, or should industry kind of prepare for yet another seismic shift of in the Latin American Pangea?
We are still in the mountain building phase in LATAM Pangea. I don't see any stability. Atanu, just in the months of November and December, just Brazil, just pesticide and crop protection, the number of new standards that Anvisa got out that will affect you. Well, Anvisa, MAPA, and IBAMA, the three agencies, 1, 2, 3, these were just December, okay? Um, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 major standards in the month of December from 3 different agencies just for pesticides, just
Wow.
for crop protection products. That's Brazil, one sector, and that's across the board.
Sure.
You see just major things happening. For example, we're just all waiting, on bated breath for overdue publication in Peru and Brazil that will be the starting blocks for their REACH inspired schemes because it's the implementing regulation. Both of them have a law, and now they need the implementing regulation. And those are already drafted, have already been through public comments, and are awaiting publication. Delayed both in both cases for different reasons. But once those I'm expecting this year, I already expected them. But I think the REACH inspired schemes are these big things, but don't forget all of the fervent bubbling going on in those regulated sectors like the pesticides, like the cosmetics products. Mexico with this brand new draft standard on labeling for paints and coatings. So you've got to be busy on both the chemical products at the industrial and meta level, and then all of your functional use categories that we already had, like the new and the old going on at once. So it's bubbling, but I do see tectonic changes still going on. I think that the mountains are starting to emerge of the new chemical control pathways for the countries that have adopted it, and continued spread of GHS in 2026 coming online, being extended to new product categories, wholesale adoption in new countries like Honduras and several other countries. That grows in part also by the great work of UNITAR. UNITAR is out and has as a mission instruction to countries in the Caribbean, Central America in particular, to help them adopt the GHS, and they're out there doing a lot of great work on that. And that's going to lead to, I expect, several countries to move toward wholesale national adoption of the GHS in 2026.
All right. Well, thank you for that. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And Melissa, any last words or a takeaway you have for our audience?
Yes, I think that in this time of shifting political alliances and all, it's requiring all of us to rethink the maps for our companies. Companies are calling me more than ever and looking at countries that they never looked at. It used to be Latin America for a company would be about 6 major markets. And I'm getting requests for Costa Rica, Jamaica, and hey, what are they doing in Trinidad? I think that the global political and trade and tariff shifts are causing companies to look at sourcing and producing in different places and selling into new places. So, as compliance professionals, we are going to be stretched to help our companies enter new markets. So, I would say entering new markets is one of the meta trends I see for 2026 and supplying from new markets. The Brazil government just put out a new map showing the importance of Brazil in rare earth minerals. Super, super interesting. What a big part they share in those resources. So I think that whether you are sourcing or whether you are selling, you will be looking at Latin America and more countries in Latin America than you have ever before in your career. That's my experience for now.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Melissa. For more about Melissa, please visit the Hack Your Hazcom site, where you can find out more about her background, contact information, of course, to listen to previous shows. And thanks again, Melissa, for your time.
Absolute pleasure to be in your home, so to speak. Thanks so much, Atana.
You're welcome.